Welcome to the Bordeaux Show, an ongoing exploration of the famed region and its wines. I'm Ron Edwards, Master Sommelier and Director of Wine Education here at Winebow. We invite you to place any and all questions or comments in the Q&A. We're not really going to manage the chat window, so that's where you'll put all the communication you want us to see. Let me introduce your host. As usual, certified Bordeaux educator TJ Griffin. TJ has held many jobs within the wine industry, from hospitality to wholesale. I'm a little tongue-tied this morning, TJ, I'm sorry. Throughout his career, what he enjoyed most was learning about wine and sharing that knowledge with others. As corporate wine educator for Winebow, he now enjoys the privilege of doing what he loves full time, which is indeed a real privilege. And now here to discuss today's topic, the families of Bordeaux. And I believe we're specifically dealing with not just the left bank, but Saint-Estèphe and Pauillac. We're dealing with royalty today, TJ.
Yes, very exciting stuff today. We're getting into, I don't know, is it fair to say that I think that most people, when they think of Bordeaux, they're thinking of probably Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, Margaux, and Saint-Julien?
Maybe even if they're not necessarily thinking of the appellations because they're not that narrow in their thinking, they're still thinking about that general area where all of those famous names are from and from where the most expensive wines come from, more or less, save, the two anomalies in Pomerol, I suppose. But yeah, it's definitely what I immediately think of when I think Bordeaux.
Yeah, so if you recall last time, we were in the Médoc, and there's the two sort of regional appellations of Médoc and Haut-Médoc. And we also covered two of the communal appellations, Listrac, Médoc, and Mouly. And then today we're going to get into the biggies. And initially, I was thinking that I could perhaps do all four of the biggies in one webinar, but it quickly proved to be not realistic. There's just too much to talk about, Ron, with these appellations. So as you said, we're going to start in the north of these four with Saint-Estèphe, and then we're going to move slightly south to Pauillac, and then we're going to stop. And then next time we'll cover Saint-Julien and Margaux.
I think that sounds like a great plan because the people I see here in the audience probably would like to know a little bit more than surface.
Yeah, well, there's a lot. There's so much to talk about here. We could probably do a pretty engaging webinar just on one of these, but we want to respect people do probably have a life outside of our webinars.
No way, not possible.
It's probably true. Maybe not. You're right. Maybe this is it. This is what people live for. But yeah, so we're going to start in Saint-Estèphe and then move down to Pauillac here. And this is the map that, as always, that you can find on Bordeaux.com. So we'll start in Saint-Estèphe. This is the second largest of the 6 communal appellations after Margaux, which we'll talk about next time. Now, we've talked about this a few times about the history of viticulture in Bordeaux, and a lot of it was on the right bank because a lot of the left bank was marshy, and that didn't get drained until not too long ago in the history of the world. But there were vines here planted as far back as ancient Rome, so it does have a little bit of a history. But when the marshlands were drained in the 17th century, then it really started to come into its own. So there it is, highlighted, and this is from the Médoc website, which again, I have all the website addresses at the end, so if you're looking for those. So here we are at Saint-Estèphe, situated almost in the center of the Médoc region, very close to the Gironde estuary, as you can see there, and we'll see in some photos. Just separated from Pauillac by a stream, but the two are very, very different, depending on where you are, and we'll talk about that later on. Sometimes the chateau, if it's on the border, can have a little bit of that Pauillac quality to it, but in general, the appellations are quite different. The best terroirs here are along the gravel croup, with those outcrops of gravel overlooking the estuary. Then there's low-lying clay and sandy soils. There's, as we go west into the appellation, there's quite a bit of limestone. Very well known for a long time as a Cabernet-heavy appellation. That has been changing over the last couple of decades. A lot more Merlot planted now. I believe about 40% of the total plantings are now Merlot. And we have 5 classified estates, not as much as some of the other appellations, but 5 growths, if you will. So there you can see a nice photo, Ron, of that's how close we are to the estuary.
That's pretty close right there. You know, I think you could, well, you might not be able to throw a rock from there. At least I couldn't throw a rock in the water from there, but maybe somebody could. But that's definitely serious river influence on that vineyard at least. Do you have
Yeah.
some idea of like how far into the appellation you have really significant river influence, or is it the whole appellation?
Well, I'd say the whole appellation, of course, is influenced. It's not that large, but you know, as you get closer to the estuary, of course, that's going to be dialed up a little bit. But the big difference, Ron, is actually the soil. So as I was just saying, as we're really close to the estuary, it's a lot of gravel, and we know that Cabernet likes gravel. As we go inland, there's a lot more clay, and we're going to talk about this a little more in depth when we talk about the style. But Saint Estèphe had a reputation. You might recall this from your early days in the business, but it had a reputation as maybe a little bit rustic, a little bit hard, and that was because apparently there was a lack of, you know, until fairly recently. I'm talking, you know, last 40, 50 years or whatever, but they were trying to force the square peg into the round hole by planting Cabernet in the clay, and it just wasn't ripening fully. So by the time they picked it, those tannins are a little bit astringent, a little bit hard, and that gave it that edge. But that has certainly changed for a couple of reasons. You know, the viticultural and winemaking know-how has certainly improved. We've talked about that a few times. Climate change has certainly evened out the vintages a little bit. And they have also realized, hey, Cabernet doesn't do as well in clay soil, so we're going to plant more Merlot. One quote, I don't remember the exact quote, but one of the more well-known winemakers of the region still says it's a, you know, kind of a fine balance, because too much Merlot will soften it too much, and then it won't be Saint Estèphe. But too much Cabernet can be a little problematic as well. So they're sort of trying to tread that fine line and keep it as true Saint Estèphe wines, while still, you know, planting the Merlot where it needs to be planted and softening that up.
Which of course immediately opens up the argument of, well, if it has to be made in a style that wasn't really the full capability of the area, why is that the true Saint Estèphe style, right? You know, one of those things that you're always asking, like, well, it had to be, it wasn't Chianti if it didn't have white wine blended into it. And you're like, well, wait a minute. Why did that make it great Chianti? Or, you know, so Saint Estèphe is one of those places in Bordeaux that's really going to see its definition evolve significantly in our generation. Because yes, I remember tasting some of those wines from the early 80s and late 70s when people were generous of Saint Estèphe, and they lived up to that reputation of edgy and hard tannins, and they were still delicious wines, but they were not didn't have the balance and elegance of some of the other appellations. Well, you start putting Merlot into the blend, you put 30% Merlot in what used to be a, you know, 90 or 80 or 90, 95% Cabernet wine, and it's going to be a significantly different wine no matter who's making it. So, you know, I'm interested in the evolution of Saint Estèphe, because I have a hard time now using that old definition broadly about Saint Estèphe wines, about them being rustic, because there's not much that's rustic in Bordeaux anymore. So regardless of where you're coming from.
Yeah, and I think you and I have talked about this, and Chianti's a great example of this too. There's an expectation of certain appellations. There's an expectation, if you go into Chianti Classico, the different communes, what they're supposed to taste like. How much of that is the terroir, and how much of that is winemaking decisions that they want to fulfill the already, you know, the preconceived notions about the appellation. And I think it's both. I think that there's definitely some terroir differences in these major appellations, but I also think they're consciously or unconsciously, or both, there's an effort to say, well, we're going to make this Saint Estèphe. We're not going to make a Pauillac. We're not going to make a Margaux, because they probably could make a different style of wine if they wanted to. Ultimately, the winemaker can trump terroir, as we know. But there is something to be said about the terroir. So it's one of those mysteries that keeps us interested in wine. It can't be
Absolutely.
neatly answered.
Yeah, and just sort of a point of order about, whoa, wait a minute. You said the gravel beds were closer to the water and the clay is further away. Um, right? That's how you stated it a few minutes ago. And if you're in the audience and you're thinking, well, that seems backwards to me. Why isn't the clay closer to the river? Remember that estuaries form by flooding and receding, and those really small particles. Clay is a very, very small silty particle when it's originally deposited, and it's going to need really slow to almost still water to filter out and settle down, which means you have to be out of the current, over by the bank, or in a big eddy or something like that for it to settle in. And so these gravel mounds that are here from the past flooding are where the water was moving faster and carried the finer particles away and left the little rocks behind. And the closer you are to the steady flow of the river, the larger the particles are going to be over time. So that's why you have this seemingly odd anomaly that the gravel is closer to the water instead of further away.
That was a very good explanation. Thank you for that.
You're welcome. I always wanted to be a geologist.
Well, you're a part-time geologist. How's that? So here's some numbers. You've seen this in the last webinar. This is again from the Médoc website. Just tells you a little bit about how many hectares, the average production of bottles. I love their spelling of independent, which sometimes turns into an E. So we'll have to keep our eyes out if it turns into an E for us today. And it has all 5 of the different types of estates, as we've talked about in the past. It has 5 cru classés, 1 cru artisan, 19 cru bourgeois, 1 co-op, and 32 other grots. So Ron, one of the things that we talk about with the style of these wines is, of these appellations, is tannin. And it's not just the quantity of the tannin, it's the quality of the tannin. And that is where I think, again, both terroir and winemaking come into play. But just to recap, sort of like we recapped last time about what is a hectare, I figured we could talk about what is tannin.
Oh, so this isn't a picture of a bunch of different colors of sand.
No, this is, do you know there's a website just devoted to tannin called tannin.org?
I did not know that, but I'm not the least bit surprised that you found it.
So this is a nice photo from their website, and it's not a wine website. It's about tannin, which is, it's a chemical compound found in almost all plant life, not all, but almost all, from all over the world, from all different climates. So it's a pretty universal thing. Scientifically, they're called polyphenols or polyphenols, which are a subset of antioxidants. And polyphenols in grapevines tend to be in the skins and seeds and stems of the grapes. And so we see the tannic wines tend to be red wines because why? They macerate with their skins and get all that released. If you are a fan of orange wines, you might notice that even though they're white grapes, they have a little tannin to them. Not as much as we see in the grapes, because not only is it a winemaking thing, different grapes have different levels of tannin, and the tannins manifest themselves differently. And that's what's interesting, because it's not just one kind of tannins. There's thousands of different polyphenols, right? A few of the major ones are resveratrol, which is supposedly very good for your heart and your cholesterol level. Although I did read something in the research for this that to get the full benefits, you might have to drink hundreds of glasses of red wine a day, which I think could be problematic for other reasons.
That could be unhealthy to your liver. So you prevent cancer and have cirrhosis instead. That's probably not a good trade-off.
No.
Or you could have pomegranate juice. I hear pomegranate juice has way more resveratrol than grape juice anyway, but that's a whole nother story.
Whole nother story, but a lot of good stuff, a lot of healthy stuff in the antioxidant category. Resveratrol, quercetin, anthocyanins. Anthocyanins are the ones that give the pigment to wines, and different grapes have different levels of anthocyanins. So you'll get purple, you'll get ruby, you'll get pale ruby, you'll get crimson, all those different colors. Procyanidins, ellagic acid, catechins, these are all really important polyphenols that are in wine. And here's what's interesting, Ron. It depends on, it depends on the grape. It depends on the climate, depends how it's grown. It depends on how, some winemaking methods, and all these factors will determine not just the level, but the mix of these different kinds of tannins. So they can really manifest themselves in very different ways.
So what you're telling me is, and translating some of this to the audience maybe, and by the way, I just love how geeky you MW students are. You guys are so wonderfully geeky. You make us MS people look normal. So the idea here is that when you say to somebody, well, Grenache, for instance, it's not hard tannin, but it's a little gritty, as opposed to Nebbiolo, which has this really aggressive drying. It can feel powdery, but yet very aggressive. And then there's Cabernet tannin, which we've gotten used to depending on where it's from and so forth. All of that texture and the way the impression it gives you in the visceral sense is all a ratio of each one of these available compounds and how they've manifested through the idea of climate, grape type, soil perhaps is a player there, right? And because of and how much sunshine they get, right? Because the polyphenols are softened by UV light.
Yeah, and certain polyphenols regulate UV radiation too inside the plant. So it's really, you can go down you can get into graduate level, plant biology pretty quickly with this topic. So we won't go there, but
that's good, because I wouldn't understand anything you're talking about.
So you made a good point, though. Different grapes seem to have different levels of tannin, but different types of tannin. And my friend Nick Jackson, speaking of the MW program, Master of Wine, Nick Jackson, I think I've referenced his book Beyond Flavor. His personal markers for tasting wines blind, which is a big part of the exam, is learning to identify the shapes of these tannins, where they are in your mouth. And it's personal, perhaps, but I've found enough of it to be true, to be helpful. And what we see with Cabernet Sauvignon and all the Bordeaux varieties, Merlot, Cabernet Franc, Carmenere, Malbec, Petit Verdot, they tend to be high in tannins, and they tend to be very structured, and Cabernet especially. And that's what we've always heard that. One of the first things you learn about Bordeaux, Cabernet provides the structure, Merlot provides the flesh. But that doesn't mean to say that Merlot doesn't have its own structure. But Cabernet seems to have, there's a very British word that perfectly sums it up for me, and it's foursquare. Those foursquare tannins that really provide a frame for the wine. We're going to get that in all our Cabernet wines. How it manifests itself, though, is different, and how it manifests itself in these different appellations is definitely different. So this is Saint Estèphe to me. Again, I think we talked about this recently. This is subjective. There's a lot that we can say is we have in common, but at the end of the day, how you perceive this is very subjective to you. So this, my take on style here is going to be a mix of common wisdom from experts far beyond my experience with Bordeaux, and my own personal experience. So we talked about this, Ron, offline. I wish everyone could hear all of our conversations, because then we could.
I don't wish they could hear all our conversations. That's nuts. What are you thinking, man?
Well, then they know what I'm talking about, because I always direct.
Oh, they know too much is what they would know. No,
we
don't need that.
Okay, well,
we don't need that.
But we talked about blind tasting, and on the MW exam, there is a little bit of points awarded to getting to the right appellation. Are you in quality? Are you going to recognize the quality? Okay, and are you left bank, you right bank? And if you're in the left bank, are you in Saint Estèphe, Pauillac, Margaux, Saint-Julien? Are you in Pessac-Léognan, which is a different part, not in the Médoc? And so one of the ways to get to that is looking for this power of the tannins, which Saint Estèphe has, even though that rustic hard edge is probably gone in the top wines, and even the most of the wines now, because they know what they're doing. And even if there's Merlot in it, you're still getting, this rich tannic structure. You're getting that power, that, this is my image choice for this, is this bull in the field. He's just, he's resting, but you can see the power there. And these are very age-worthy wines that perhaps are a little tough in their youth. Maybe not meant to drink in the first couple of years after release, but will age, the top wines will age for decades because they have that structure.
Yeah, when you start talking about modern Saint-Estèphe, it's a holistic conversation for all of Bordeaux, right? And so everybody in Bordeaux has gone down this path of experimenting with winemaking technique, and maybe they're using micro-oxygenation at some level, maybe they're using less, maybe they're using more new oak than they used to, maybe they're using less new oak than they're used to, but they've all gone down this path for a particular purpose, and that is to make the most seamless and appellation related wines that they can, right? And in the case of Saint-Estèphe, that's sort of a tough path to follow, right? If your reputation was wines that are rustic, that doesn't sound very likely to be in the top price tier of style, right? So when you start looking at the number of chateaus that are made by a handful of consultants in Bordeaux, literally 5 to 10 total consultants. It'd be interesting, TJ. We should figure this out. Maybe what percentage of the wine in Bordeaux is made by 10 or less people, or at least supervised by it, right?
A significant proportion.
Yeah, it's pretty big. So, and your neighbor down the street in Pauillac, because it really is down the street. We're not talking about 40 miles. It's just right over there. Is getting 98 points for their wine, and they're using micro-ox, and they're making them more approachable in youth, and they're, following this path. And you're like, well, I really like my older style of wine, but they're getting $100 more a bottle than I am. That's an economic pressure not to stick with tradition. And I think that has really come to bear in the styles that we see modern Bordeaux approaching. Between that and the fact that it's riper, warmer, easier to get things not rustic, I think we have to sort of put the rustic comment on the back burner for Saint-Estèphe. But I think I agree with you 100% that the wines should show strength and body and intensity, and maybe not quite as much overall balance as Pauillac or Saint-Julien. And of course, you're going to go producer to producer, because in the end, the most influential aspect of terroir is the hand of man, because it's in everything. And how much we intervene is going to dictate final product's likeliness to resemble our idea or what nature gave us purely. And it's really hard to get a wine that's purely what nature gave us. And often I don't really want that wine, because nature can be a cruel mistress at times, especially in the fermentation vat. All right, I'll stop diatribing and let you finish your.
No, it's worth a conversation at some point. Perhaps this will be a topic later on. But in appellations like Saint-Estèphe and Pauillac that were made to be laid down, you weren't supposed to be opening these in the first 5 years, at least. But nobody does that anymore, and I wouldn't say nobody. Very few people do it, or not as many as used to, and I don't know why. I don't know if that's something you have an opinion on, but how do you reckon with that as an estate that's been making the style for hundreds of years, and now you have to make an approachable wine? So I think one of the answers was second and third wines, and they are using techniques like micro-ox that make them a little bit more approachable in their youth while still retaining the structure to age if people want to.
I think when you look at the concept of drinking now versus holding, it really starts to hit really heavily on who's buying versus who used to buy. And Bordeaux was, for a couple centuries almost, primarily bought by the British and internally by the French, right? And they were bought by the people who could afford fine wines, whose family had been buying wines for generations, who had cellars, not like we think of, like the refrigerator underneath the counter in the kitchen, not like that, like real cellars with thousands of bottles of wine that had been collected over generations. So there was no pressure to drink the new vintage. That's what, there was no need to, but you start with an entirely new group of buyers. China comes on board, the US comes on board. Wealth starts to spread beyond a more narrow upper class that can afford these wines, at least up until the 1990s vintages, right? And then all of a sudden there's an entire new group of wine drinkers out there who are used to drinking young, new release wines because that's what they had. And they're not offended by the brashness of a young red wine from Bordeaux because they're used to it from other places. And I think that changed the consuming patterns drastically. And I don't think it's going back the other direction.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is here to stay. So I wanted to highlight some of the more well-known chateau in Saint-Estèphe. These are not, authoritative recommendations on what you should go collect. We can talk about that maybe in a future episode, but I just, these are the ones you want to, if you haven't experienced Saint-Estèphe, go check these out. And they're not, well, at least in Saint-Estèphe, they're not crazy unaffordable. We'll get some value here. So this is Château Cos d'Estournel. This is a second growth. It is apparently, as you're going north from Pauillac, the first chateau that you will see, and it's striking. This is a very striking winery with its Chinese influenced architecture, and apparently the wooden doors that you can kind of see there are from Zanzibar. It's a really unique chateau, and no one lives there. This is just a winery. The owners live somewhere else. I think it'd be kind of cool to live there, but I guess they need the space. So speaking of its proximity to Pauillac, it shares a long border with Lafite Rothschild, which is of course in Pauillac. So some people say that it's maybe a little more Pauillac than other wineries in Saint-Estèphe. They're very gravelly soils here, but there's a pretty high proportion of Merlot planted, about 35–38%, which is high for Saint-Estèphe. So you do have that gravel influence, but you also have the Merlot. So, and this is owned by an entrepreneur that I don't know his name off the top of my head, but this is owned by a person, not a company.
Yeah, you can count on Côte d'Estournel to be impressive.
Yes.
It's broad-shouldered, but pretty darn elegant. And I think it does act a lot like Great Pauillac. I think it acts like a cross between Lafite and Latour as far as stylistically concerned.
Château Montrose. This is a quote that I read, said that, Château Montrose is considered the more traditional of these two, because this is also second growth. So these two estates were like the top estates of Saint-Estèphe. But the former owner said of that comment, yes, people have been saying that now for 60 years. So is it what's modern? I don't know. It's just different. Let's say that. But this is supposedly the more traditional. This chateau is very well known for producing very good wines in difficult vintages. So this was a collector's item. People would go after this if they found out the vintage was a little bit tricky. And this one, chateau, is owned by a pair of billionaire brothers. A lot of billionaire owners here in this part of the world, because you have to be.
It takes billions so that you can lose millions and still have your money. And just personal experience, I would put Montrose in that category of less lush than Cos d'Estournel. It's just a little bit more reserved style. I wouldn't call it rustic, but it's definitely a little more angular.
Do you think that's what people are talking about when they say it's the more traditional of the
Yeah,
two?
I think so. I think they're pointing to the idea that it just has less fruit forwardness, I guess would be a best. And it's texturally, I mean, Cos d'Estournel approaches velvet at times in ripe vintages, and I've never had a Montrose that's beyond a really nice satin type feel.
This is a third growth, Château Calon-Ségur. This is the most northerly classified growth in the Médoc and one of the oldest. It was slow to modernize. It was owned by a widow for many years, and one of my older books that dates from the 90s, he tried to interview her for the book, and very hard to get a hold of her, and she wouldn't answer many of his questions. Apparently her response was, I don't think that's important. So very, very slow to modernize, but I think she's no longer with us. It's now owned by an insurance company, and they have invested a ton of money into it. And this is producing, it's punching above its weight for third growth. It's competing with the first two in terms of quality and popularity. What, do you have any experience with Calon-Ségur?
Yeah, it was back when Bordeaux prices started to really soar. I would go to this chateau for Saint Estèphe to have something on a wine list that wasn't in a super fine dining restaurant, to have something of this quality that represented the appellation at a price that, you know, normal upper class people could afford. And it never disappointed me. It was always a really good bottle of wine.
Do you know this winery?
I do. We import that winery.
Yes, we do. So this is,
and I like that winery, not just because we import it, but it's delicious.
It is delicious. It's so Château Beau-Site, meaning beautiful site, of course, owned by Bory Manu since 1955. They have put a ton of money as well into this. And apparently back in the 19th century, this was a very highly regarded winery. But when it came time for the classification, the owner did not provide samples.
Oops. What do you want, Sam? No, I don't give anybody samples. What are you talking about? Things you wish you could do over, right?
Who knew? Who knew it was going to be this big, you know?
Doesn't that qualify as one of those commercials right now? Want to get away?
It's like the guy who didn't sign the Beatles because he didn't think they were going to make
Yep.
So this probably would have been a classified growth. It certainly has the quality of a classified growth, and the amount of care taken with the wine and the vineyards is certainly on that level of a classified growth. But the price is, depending on market and vintage, is around $40 to $50 retail. So a bargain, a deal here.
Yeah, this is in the concept of Cabernet-based wines worldwide, this is a whole lot of wine for the money. I mean, think about what you're buying for $40 to $50 out of Napa and Sonoma. Think of what you're buying, you know, places other than, like, the place you get more for your money perhaps is South America, where the economics are just completely different. But when you talk about premier appellations around the world, this wine is a steal.
Absolutely. I did want to mention, again, I could spend probably another half hour talking about the estates, but you guys can go learn about those on your own. But these are some I wanted to highlight as being well-known and good values and good representations of the appellation. Of course, there's another one here. There's a fifth growth Cos-Laborie that you should be familiar with as well. So these are just ones to check out. I'm not going to get too deep into these. I think that's enough. I think we've talked about the chateau enough because we have to move on.
Although I will tell you, I've had some really great success in the past with Le Orme de Pez as a really affordable, delicious offering on wine lists.
And they invented the candy, right? The Pez family?
Maybe. I don't know.
All right, Pauillac. So
I want a Pez Saint Estèphe dispenser. That's what I want. You know,
yes, that would be cool.
Little droplets of Saint Estèphe come out instead.
Can you do a Pez and Pez pairing? Do you think that you could pull that off?
Probably not.
So Pauillac was, there's a little bit more history to talk about. Pauillac. It was a very important port as far back as 2000 BCE. They were, you know, shipping bronze. So it was already well known. And then when wine hit, of course, and the marshes were drained, it became a natural outlet for production, which might explain why it has so many great chateaux. This is known by its relief. So here you have the three of the first growths. You have 2 second growths, 1 fourth growth, and 12 fifth growths. This is crazy amount of classified wines here. A lot of quality, a lot of money, a lot of high-priced wines. This is the deepest gravel in the Médoc, but it also does have higher clay content than most of the other Médoc appellations. High percentage of Cabernet Sauvignon, despite that. But the gravels that they do have are extremely well draining, which, as we know, Cabernet loves. So this is just a picture of how amazingly pretty this area is in some of these chateaus. So we'll talk about the chateaus in a second because there's a lot to talk about. So here, slightly less of the vineyard, a slightly less production, and slightly less wine growers too. And of course, the Cru Classé, 18 Cru Classé. But what you don't see here is Cru Artisan. And apparently, Cru Bourgeois, not big here either because there's so many class growths. And over time, too, as we've discussed in, I think, a previous webinar, is when they Cru Classé buys vineyard area, it becomes Cru Classé. And that has certainly happened over the years. This, Ron, is what I think of as Pauillac. And again, we're going to be very subjective, but Pauillac has power, but it's the I didn't want to do this because it's so cliche, but the iron fist and the velvet glove. If you think this is Simone Biles, of course, if you don't know who she is, probably the greatest woman gymnast of all time, one of the greatest gymnasts of all time. She just set another record by performing some move that has never been performed by a woman in competition ever. And that's not the first time she's done that. I believe she's invented moves. And she's so graceful and athletic and elegant, but undeniably powerful underneath. And that's what I think of as Pauillac. You know, rich, complex, firm, but just always has that touch of finesse that you were talking about, I think, when you talked about Cos d'Estournel, having that quality to it as opposed to other Saint Estèphe wines because it has sort of that Pauillac influence, perhaps.
Yeah, when you have the opportunity to taste the upper tier producers of Pauillac, they just stop you in your tracks. You know, you can get a little jaded about the idea of Bordeaux because the prices are so off-putting at this point. And no, I think I'm more interested in, I don't know, Nebbiolo or whatever you're really like sort of defaulting to, maybe sometimes out of price tier, sometimes out of, you know, just defiance. I don't want to be like everybody else. But when you objectively or subjectively get shown a Mouton or a Latour or a Lafite or one of the other classified growths from this area, you have no choice but to admit how amazing and complex and layered and balanced these wines are. They're powerful, but everything's right where it's supposed to be. And it really is inspiring to taste the quality level that comes out of Pauillac. Even at lesser expensive wines, they really are. I love your image here. I think it's really true because these wines can be so tightly wound too, like a gymnast. Mm-hmm. There's like just amazing power hiding in a small area of space, so to speak. And then it just unfolds with time. So yeah, I like this image. Not to mention Simone is amazing.
Yes. And to quote my friend Nick again, what he calls Pauillac, and I think it's really, when he said that, I was like, okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. There's certainly a lot of tannin here, right? There's a high amount of tannin, but he calls them fruit-wrapped tannins. And I like that image. You know, they're there, but there's something velvety and elegant about them underneath. Even though it's mostly Cabernet. In good vintages, the top estates are 85% Cabernet Sauvignon. That's a lot of Cabernet for Bordeaux. So, but even so, there's just something about the terroir. There's something about tradition that has this elegance with the power.
Yeah, it's a really nice luxury that for the last, well, let's see, since about 1860, every one of these chateaus has had whatever money they needed to reinvest.
Yes. Yeah, so we've talked about that as well because it's, money begets money. And the more money you have, the more money you can make and the more improvements you can make. So you have more money to improve. But here we are, Château Lafite Rothschild, one of the great growths, one of the first growths. And apparently back in the original classification, this was considered the top. This was it. As one wine writer that I read put it, now it's really, of the 5 first growths, it's more of a matter of personal preference. You can't really say there's a quality difference anymore. They're just different styles, but certainly one of the benchmark wines of the world. This is considered to be an elegant, particularly elegant style of Pauillac. I have not, I think, Ron, ever tried a Lafite Rothschild, unfortunately.
Well, I hope that changes for you, because it lives up to its reputation, and through the generosity of others, I have had enough of these various bottlings to attest to this is my favorite of the first growths of Pauillac, because it's my style, not because it's a better quality.
Is it that elegance that you're?
Yeah, it's really seamless, elegant. It's not, it never hits you with power, but there's plenty of power there. And honestly, it sort of starts to reflect the style out of Saint Julien, which is my favorite appellation. So it makes a whole lot of sense that I would like Lafite more than Latour, which is really powerful and rich.
Mm-hmm. And of course, this is owned by members of the Rothschild family. So speaking of Latour, there we are. And that's where it gets its name, the tower. That's a 14th century tower there on their property, and that's where the name comes from. Here's some notes that a winemaker says it way better than me, and I think you just alluded to this. Combines power, concentration, purity with just a hint of austerity and a regal bearing. So a little bit different style than the perhaps more elegant Lafite. This is a wine that really, even now, when things are different, needs to be aged. You know, these are wines that can be quite tight and closed and very tannic in their youth, but will age beautifully for decades. I have had some older, just a couple of times, some older Latour, and a lot older than I would have expected, because I think I was a lot newer in my wine career at the time, and was blown away by how fresh it tasted. Even though the color had started to fade, it wasn't fading that much on the palate, which was interesting. I always associate the color. Okay, if I see the color is gone, then it must be gone. But that's not really a reliable marker for the great wines.
No, I've seen a couple of anomalies there. A friend of mine had a birthday and invested heavily in his wine for his birthday. He was born in 1965, which is not really a good vintage in Europe. And so he went searching, and he ended up ordering straight from the chateaus, 1865 Latour and Lafite, and had him at his birthday party and tasted them blind with us. So we had no relevance. And I guessed them as 1959s at 140 years old.
Wow.
It was
That's incredible.
crazy.
I need friends like that.
Yeah, I miss those friends. They're still in Michigan, and I'm here, so I don't have those privileges anymore.
Yeah, some of my friends, and I love them dearly, maybe we'd have a case of Budweiser from 1959, which I don't think holds up as well.
That does not sound appealing.
Sorry, friends, if you're watching. I don't mean all of you. I love you all. So Mouton Rothschild, famously in the original classification, was a second growth, but the Baron Philippe never gave up. He always petitioned that he should be a first growth, and always considered himself a first growth. And on one of the few changes in the entire classification system, period, from any growth to any growth, he was moved up to first growth in 1973. And famously, the label said, I want to get the wording right here. Premier je suis, second je fus, Mouton ne change. First I am, second I was, I, Mouton, do not change. So he was always considered himself a first growth, or considered the winery, not himself, but the winery of first growth, the Chateau. So also extremely famous for their artist labels, which started in 1945 when France was liberated. And then they've had some of the 20th century, some of history's greatest art: Salvador Dali, Picasso, Andy Warhol, Chagall, David Hockney. I mean, it's really an iconic label, you know. And this is also owned by members of the Rothschild family, but a different branch, just cousins, I would imagine, but not the same owners of Lafite. And this is supposedly, in comparison, I don't have the experience of trying these side by side, so I have to rely on others. Although I did have an older Mouton, it's delicious. This is the most exotic style. This is the most flamboyant style of the three biggies here in Pauillac. I don't know if that rings true for you, Ron, what your experience with this is.
Without doubt. They use a lot more new oak. It's very fleshy, very spiced and aromatic from outside influence, not from the grapes, from the oak aging primarily. And certainly the more luxuriant stylistically, I guess would be a good way to put it, which is why I think it found such great fans in the New World, where we're used to, 100% new oak Cabernet out of California and things like that. These are styles that start to ring true with people who have the money to spend on both. So
certainly a wine that can age, but perhaps a little more approachable in its youth than the first two we talked about.
Yeah, I think it's more approachable young, although, all three of these wines that we've talked about need time. This one is friendly just by nature of the makeup on the wine, or the window dressing, so to speak, is easy to discern in youth, even if the depth of the wine is hiding a bit.
Ron, I apologize, but I did not
I
change
might.
the picture. But talk about
Château Beau-Site Batailley.
That is Château Beau-Site.
Was this a quiz? Ron, are you seeing the same picture? Can you identify this chateau?
How many differences are there between this? Oh, I feel terrible for doing it. But
that's all right. A chateau is just a chateau. It's the wine that matters.
But yes, this is a fifth growth Château Batailley, a fifth growth Pauillac. Is Bory Manou's flagship property, named from the battle in the 100 Years' War that happened right here in this area. 57 hectares, deep gravel bed, but also some clay and sandstone. And there's parcels mixed in with Château Latour and Pichon Lalonde. So good pedigree here. And again, similar to Beau-Site, it's a little more expensive than Beau-Site, but that's to be expected. We're in Pauillac here, and we're a classified growth. I think if Beau-Site was a classified growth, it would be a little more expensive, but still great. You're interspersed with vineyards from Château Latour, and you retail for about $80 to $90. So talk about value.
Yeah, this is a really nice wine when you're treating yourself. It's a special weekend, it's a birthday, it's a meaningful moment in your life where you feel comfortable investing the extra dollars. This wine is totally worth it. Totally worth it.
Under three figures for classified growth Bordeaux from Pauillac is, whether it's an everyday drinking wine or not, it's still a bargain. And this is, of course, owned by a family. So this is still a family-owned property. And some other ones to look out for. The Pichons, before 1850, these were a single large estate, and it must have been tremendously large because these are still quite large today. You have Pichon Baron, Pichon Lalonde, both second growths. The Pichon Lalonde's owned by Louis Roederer, Champagne House. Duhar Milon, owned by Lafite Rothschild. Château Batailley was once part of the Batailley, another gigantic estate that was split into two and still quite big. But Batailley is owned by the Cos family, who own Lynch-Bages. Pontet Canet was the first classified growth to be certified biodynamic. And there's others I could certainly go on. Grand Puy Lacoste, Grand Puy Ducasse, Château Lynch-Moussat, Château Armaillac, and Château Clerc-Milon, to just mention a few. And a lot of the similar names, because these gigantic estates were split up when, from different family gets big, and this side takes that, and this side takes that, and that happens. But certainly not as split up as you would see like in Burgundy. Maybe they had smaller families. All right, so that was our tour of the Saint-Estèphe and Pauillac appellations, and here are some websites that you can check out. Ron, saintestephe.com when I went to it, it said I am forbidden to go to it, but not from some sort of IT thing with Winebow. On their side, I'd never seen this in my life, and it was interesting. It said
they were blocking our server.
Yeah, so it said something about country, and I tried on different browsers, and I could not get on. So I would love to hear from anybody who's watching this. Next time, tell me if you were able to get on, because I was not able to get on.
They were waiting to see what you said this week in your webinar before they were going to let you on.
Well, maybe it said you can, if you think this is an error, you can contact the webmaster. So I haven't done that, but I do think it's an error. I want to be on. I want to see this secret website.
Isn't that just the funniest thing that we now have in our modern language? Doesn't it sound like a weird sci-fi movie paragraph from, I don't know, 1970s? If you think there's an error, contact the webmaster. Just things that have developed in our lifetime. Just
a villain from the old Batman TV series.
Yes, the webmaster.
You won't get away with it, webmaster. But I think out of these 4 websites, you can find out more than you would ever want to know about these different appellations from just the Médoc website. I think it's a great website, and Bordeaux.com is a tremendous resource. And next time, Ron, we're going to talk about the other 2 of these major appellations in the Médoc, which are, of course, Saint-Julien, moving south from Pauillac, and then kind of a leap south down to Margaux. It's a little furry move. So you have Saint-Estèphe and Pauillac and Saint-Julien all in a row, and then there's a little break, and then Margaux is south. But so we're going to talk about that next time.
Fabulous.
You can join us.
Yep. They just set your calendar, 11 a.m. every Tuesday. You can hang out with us. 1 week we'll talk Bordeaux. 1 week we'll talk pre-shift, all things hospitality. And then we'll see back again with Bordeaux on June 8th. So next, on the 2nd, we will have a discussion of 3 summer reds. So I'm not going to disclose which red grapes we're going to talk about or regions, but there'll be red wines that are really well suited to the warm weather we're all about to experience.
Is it Saint-Estèphe, Pauillac, and Saint-Julien?
Probably not. Although, man, you hand me a classified growth any time of year, I'm going to drink it. But they're not the ones I would pick out initially for a summertime meal.
A heck of a backyard barbecue.
Yes. I want to go to that barbecue. And we appreciate everyone's attendance. We hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday.
Bye, everybody. Thank you.